Hi, I'm historical linguist Dr. Jackson Crawford. Most of my work in my career has focused on Old Norse, which is a language closely related to Old English, and I have done a lot of work with Old English too. Now, when I say Old English, I'm talking about a language that was near and dear to the author of The Lord of the Rings, J.R.R. Tolkien, and I'm not talking about the way that he has characters say things like I deem or hither and thither and thou and thee. Those are early modern English. Those are still recognizable as the same language that we speak today, just in a more archaic form. Old English would not be intelligible to a speaker of English today without special training. However, J.R.R. Tolkien works Old English constantly into The Lord of the Rings and The Two Towers and The Return of the King as the language of the Rohirrim. So I'm going to talk a little bit in this video about some of the basic facts about Old English for people who may not know very much about it, where you can find more resources to help you understand a little bit more about it from the perspective of somebody reading The Lord of the Rings eagerly. So this came up because I have a professional background similar to J.R.R. Tolkien's. Although I guess the fanciest university I taught at was Berkeley, and he taught at the ultimate fancy university, Oxford. We both taught subjects like Old English and Old Norse. I still teach Old Norse, at least experimentally, in some Zoom classes and talk about the stuff on YouTube a lot. And I decided to read The Lord of the Rings toward the end of 2024 and comment on it as someone with a similar professional background to his. And I was talking about it with my fiance, who doesn't have any professional background in this stuff, and mentioning the Old English language of the Rohirrim, the people of Rohan, and she didn't know anything about it. So I figured, oh well, actually, there may be a lot of people who don't. So my understanding, and I'm again similar professional background to Tolkien, but not an expert on Tolkien himself. My understanding is that modern English in his book represents, the fictional language of Middle Earth, and so Old English, as used by the people of Rohan, is meant to represent a more archaic stage of that language. But of course, that's all kind of hypothetical. The words that are on the page are modern English and Old English. Now, that includes most of the names of the people of Rohan. Rohan as the name of the land and Rohirrim as the name of the people, I believe, are Sindarin, the Elvish language. Those are not old English. Those are outsiders' names, presumably names given to them by people in Gondor who used Sindarin. Or Sindarin, I suppose, is probably how Tolkien intended that to be emphasized. But then all the names of the individuals in Rohan are Old English. So, for example, Theoden is the chieftain, right? In fact, that word Theod means nation or people. So the Theoden is the one who's over the nation or people, the prince, the ruler, the king, the chieftain. And you see that very same word that Theod is cognate with. It's from the same ancestor word as the root word in German Deutsch, the language of the people. German is closely related to English and to Old Norse. These were all Germanic languages, that part of the Germanic sub-branch of the Indo-European tree. And by the way, Germanic does not mean that they all come from German. German is just one modern instantiation of that branch. It's equally as old, if you will, as English or Norse is. We also see that Theod word in what looks like, at least in the appendices, to be the name of the Rohirrim for themselves, the Eotheod, which is Old English for horse people. Now, Eo, which you see in lots of the names of people from Rohan, right? Eowyn, which is a lovely name, like horse joy. Eomer, her brother, or the Eored, the horse council, that the troops of Rohan ride in. That is not the typical Old English word for horse, which is horse or hros, the word that gives us horse. Ao is already archaic in Old English, but it is in fact a very ancient word for horse. It is cognate with, again from the same ancestor word as, but not descended from, Latin equus, Greek hippos. All of these go back to a Proto-Indo-European, so about 5,000 years ago, word, something like ekos, which had largely died out in the Germanic languages, but is remembered in Old English poetry as well as Old Norse poetry. All of those words that have ao in Old English have yo in Old Norse. So, for example, theoden is directly, again, cognate with, from the same ancestor word, as Old Norse theoden, theodan, which is the same meaning. The horse word ao is cognate with Old Norse yo, which you do see in a few Old Norse names, like the woman's name Jofrir, horse beautiful. So the languages are closely connected that way. If you look in the back of Lord of the Rings at the appendices that have lots of family trees for different peoples, Numenorian kings and Rohirric kings and dwarves and such, you'll notice lots more of these names, including many more that have common Old English name elements in them, like Winna, meaning friend. I'm not going to go through all of those in a list here. I've talked about a lot of them in my Lord of the Rings reading videos, but where can you look these up? Well, take a look at Bosworth Toller's Dictionary of Old English, or actually I'm just so used to calling it that potentially the dictionary calls the language Anglo-Saxon, which is a name that scholars tended to use up to the middle of the 20th century and now tend to favor Old English. It may be called the Anglo-Saxon Dictionary. I don't have it in front of me in the middle, sort of nowhere right now. But there's various places online you can look at it. It's out of copyright. And just remember that very often Old English names are compounds, so you might have to look up, the first half of the word and then the second half of the word. If you don't know how to split the name into its constituent halves, don't worry too much. Probably it will be pretty easily divisible by a modern English speaker, at least into its syllables, and you don't split the syllable, right? If you see a name that you don't recognize, like Guthlof, right? Presumably Guth is the word you look up, and then Lof, and it is, right? That's battle, survivor, roughly in meaning. Just keep in mind that Old English names, like Old Norse names, aren't necessarily sentences, right? They don't necessarily have a meaning altogether. They're just combinations of elements that are culturally cogent. In Old Norse, we have women named Battle, Gunhild or Hildegun. That doesn't mean twice the battle. That's not her name. Her name is just composed of two words that are frequent in names. Although you do occasionally see names that are coherent descriptions. One of the Rohirrim has a name Weedfara, right? So like wide traveler. I'll come back in just a moment and talk a little bit more about pronouncing these names and a little bit about the poetry of Rohan. Let me just give you a quick word from my friends and partners at Grimfrost. Hey folks, we'll be back to your regular presentation in a moment, but for right now, I'm here at Grimfrost World Headquarters Longhouse with Johan Hegg, and I just want to remind you that if you have Viking needs, you have a Viking supplier. Grimfrost really cares about getting things right, and if you need replica, well, anything, right? Shields, helmets, weapons, board games, cool t-shirts, hats, all sorts of accessories like that. You can get them at grimfrost.com together with my books, and they ship just about anywhere in the world. So check them out. It does help support the channel. So by the way, a historical note about Old English and its relation to other languages. As I said, Old English is Germanic. It's from the group of languages that includes the Scandinavian languages and German. It came to Great Britain fairly late in the course of human history, beginning probably with invasions by the tribes remembered as the Angles, Saxons, Jutes, Frisians, etc., in the 400s AD. The people they displaced were largely Celts, speaking either Celtic languages related to Welsh or possibly, since they'd been in the Roman Empire so long, speaking a Romance language already. some late form of Latin, early form of some stillborn British equivalent of French or Spanish. And so when the actor who portrayed Theoden said in one of the commentaries in Lord of the Rings movies that the Rohirrim were supposed to be a Celtic people, I believe the actor's name is Bernard Hill, apparently a very well-regarded actor. I don't know anything about movies except that he's the guy that in the Mystery Science Theater Titanic special said, I'm going to sink this bitch. I don't know anything about movies, but I do know things about about languages. And Old English is in terms of social history like the opposite of a Celtic language. It's a language that displaced Celtic language. So he was not fully aware of how this worked. So Old English is not Celtic. It's Old and British. That does not mean Celtic. Stonehenge is not Celtic. Old English is not Celtic. Just because something's Old and British doesn't mean it's Celtic. Okay, I want to make a note about pronouncing names in Old English too, and this is another place where Bernard Hill, again, I'm sure a fine actor and man, made an error because I believe he says in the movies Eorlingas. Well, that would be descendants of Eorl, the Eorl being the ancestor form of the English word earl, right, like a nobleman. Because words in Old English and Old Norse are emphasized on their first syllable. So no matter how long the word is, you still emphasize that very first bit. Eorlingas would be more appropriate. And the same with all other names. Eowyn, right? Always emphasize that first syllable. Old English, being the ancestor of our own language, English, does have TH sounds. In The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien spells them TH, right? Theoden, Theoden. In true Old English texts, that TH is not spelled letter T, letter H. It is spelled with one letter, thorn, or ez. In Old Norse, we're more used to seeing thorn at the beginning of words. We can't use ez. You hear the raven? And thorn is often mistaken by people on the page for a big P with its stave line running too high. But that stands for that Theoden. By the way, Theoden and his father's name Thengel both mean something like Lord. And in Beowulf, a poem that I have read in Old English in fits and starts with Simon Roper on this channel, Beowulf himself is referred to as Hringathangel, Lord of the Rings. I've always wondered if that gave Tolkien the idea. What is a Lord of the Rings, and that kind of taking off in imagination. Of course, Lord of the Rings in an Old English sense means the one who gives rings to faithful retainers, right? The wealthy lord. Also note that in an Old English context, that Y in a name like Eowyn is not, it's not really Eowyn, it's Eowyn. It's the dude vowel I tell people. This is the vowel represented in German by a U with two dots, or in French by just a U, right? French tu, or German über have this sound. It's like the oo sound, but made much further forward in your mouth. The sound that California surfers stereotypically make when they say words like dude or tunes. So Eowyn, Eowyn, Eowyn would be a little bit closer to the intended sound of that name. I wanted to comment a little bit on their poetry in this video, although I've made a video dedicated just to the subject of their poetry. Their poetry is Old English or Old Norse in style, and it's alliterative, and it runs all through Lord of the Rings, especially in the early parts of the Return of the King. Let me see if flipping through this I can just land on a random example for you. They use alliteration, right? So words that start with the same sound. And depending on whether you look at this from an Old Norse / Scandinavian or an Old English / English or German perspective, we either have long lines that all alliterate, where all the alliteration is in that line, or you have two lines. So what Tolkien is represented here as one line a Scandinavian or someone trained by Scandinavians like myself would represent that as 2 lines. But what you have is in that the second half of the line from an English perspective, or the second line from a Scandinavian perspective, the first emphasized syllable, so not a low stress word like in or at or on, a preposition or an article like the or an, but an adjective, a verb, or a noun. The first one of those needs to start with a stress syllable that alliterates with at least one stress syllable in the preceding odd line or first half of the line from an English perspective. So if I do 3 lines from this poem on page 803 of this edition, from dark Dunharrow in the dim morning, with Thane and Captain rode Thangol's son, to Etheras he came, the ancient halls. So dark Dunharrow in the first half of the line alliterate with dim, the first stressed word in the second. Thane alliterates with Thangol, the first stressed word in the second. Etheras alliterates with ancient, the first stressed word in the second half of the line. And by the way, then also Etheras would be pronounced so, with the emphasis on the not on, it's like Edoras, but Etheras. And I'm probably making the D a little too like for those hearing my sort of too Icelandicized accent with these things, but it's because Icelandic is my primary way of approaching these languages, meters, poems, etc. This style of poetry is pretty easy to imitate in English, and like I said, I have a separate video. I don't know whether it'll be posted before or after this one about that style in a little bit more detail with a few more of Tolkien's examples if you want to try to imitate it. For those of you interested in learning more about Old English, there's an interesting book called Old English and Its Closest Relatives that you can still get. I think it may not be out of print, but I think it may be expensive. What it does is it kind of walks you through reading Old English, but also with an eye on how to apply skill in reading Old English to reading Old Norse, Gothic, Old Saxon, Old High German, other old Germanic languages. So that's a pretty neat tool. I have a lot of videos about Old English. My friend Simon Roper has a lot of videos on his channel about Old English, and we've made some together, including one where we demonstrate the partial mutual intelligibility between Old Norse and Old English. I talk to him in Old Norse, and he talks to me in Old English. And in general, there's lots of resources about Old English relative to other Old Germanic languages. That does mean, with more of them, that you have to judge a little bit more how good what's available is. But I'm always, always trying to get the word out about good resources such as there are. I'll probably put a few more at the end of this video, and especially folks on Patreon, ask if you're looking for something. And for now, thanks for watching these videos. If you are interested in old languages that look and sound cool, you might appreciate a project that I'm working on right now that I think J.R.R. Tolkien would have approved of, which is to put the poems of the Poetic Edda, the manuscript that's the source of our myths about the Norse gods, into runes. They were not preserved in runes, but to write them in runes the way they would have been if they had been preserved in runes. And I thank the folks supporting this channel on Patreon. You are the reason that the lights stay on, figuratively and literally. So thanks very much for supporting this work at patreon.com/NorseBySW. That's Norse by Southwest, Norse by SW. And from beautiful Colorado, I'm wishing you all the best.